Hello everyone. I'm really glad you're here. Tonight, I want to help you let go of the day and ease into rest. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, and it means a lot to be part of your nightly routine. So if you haven't already, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It truly helps. Now, settle in, close your eyes, and let's begin. Story number 1. It had been a long, hot day. I was in my early 30s, and the world still felt much bigger than it does now. I had just taken my 2 youngest children, aged 1 and 3, to a pediatric appointment that was an hour's drive from home. Because of our distance, the clinic had graciously given us the final appointment of the day. The doctor had recently moved into a brand new building set back on a quiet stretch of highway. A beautiful facility, but surrounded by emptiness. There were no nearby homes or businesses, and the road felt almost too quiet. When we arrived, only 4 or 5 cars dotted the lot. I parked close to the door, unbuckled the kids from their car seats, and headed inside. After the appointment, as I buckled them back in and turned the key to start the engine, nothing happened. The car was dead. I walked back to the clinic doors, holding one child on my hip and the other by the hand. The receptionist, just locking up, kindly let us back in to use the phone. I flipped through the phone book and found a nearby service station. The man on the other end said he'd come out, but it might be a while. Thanking him, I returned to the car, opened all the windows, and settled the children in their seats. The sun was still high, casting long golden shadows across the lot. I rummaged through the car for snacks, found a bottle, and tried to keep the kids cool and content as we waited in the silence of the empty lot. Soon, a truck pulled into the lot. A man stepped out, middle-aged, scruffy, wearing a stained shirt and jeans. He nodded and smiled, saying he was here to take a look at the car. I was relieved. I got back into the driver's seat while he lifted the hood. Time passed. I watched his hands move above the engine through the slit between the hood and the windshield. He said it wasn't the battery, just some loose wires. He invited me to come up and see so I'd know how to fix it next time, but I declined with a polite laugh, admitting I knew nothing about cars. Still, he kept working. I waited. Something felt off. He didn't bring jumper cables. He wasn't doing much of anything, just poking around. He repeated again that it was just some wires and encouraged me to come look, but I stayed seated, distracted by the kids, watching him from the safety of the car. The tone in his voice shifted. He seemed irritated, almost annoyed that I wouldn't approach the hood. And then, in a moment that still gives me chills, another truck pulled into the parking lot. As if struck by lightning, the man under my hood slammed it shut, darted to his own truck, and drove away without saying a word. No goodbye, no explanation, just gone. I was confused, my heart pounding, unsure what had just happened or who had arrived. The new man stepped out and immediately introduced himself. His voice was familiar. It was the man I'd spoken to on the phone, the actual mechanic. He even greeted me by name. I was still shaken, but I laughed nervously and explained that I thought the previous man had been him. We shared a small laugh as he grabbed jumper cables, walked to the front of my Jeep, and popped the hood. I sat behind the wheel, feeling the blessed breeze from the air conditioner once he signaled me to start the engine. Just as I reached back to check on the kids, he came to my window, his face pale, his expression unreadable. In his hand, he held something long and metallic, almost like a blade, about 1.5 feet in length, covered in red-brown dust. It had small loops on one end, almost like scissors or surgical shears, but terrifyingly long and thin. He asked me, "Mom, is this yours?" My stomach dropped. I had never seen it before. He told me he'd found it just lying on top of the engine, fresh, out of place. and impossibly sharp. I told him that it couldn't be from my car, but he didn't seem convinced. His hands trembled slightly as he stared down at the strange object. I tried to brush it off, maybe something old that had been there for years. But he looked me in the eyes and said, "Ma'am, these weren't here long. They're freshly sharpened. Look at this." I looked more closely. He was right. The blade gleamed unnaturally despite its rusty hue. The sharp edge was terrifying, far too sharp to be something left inside a family vehicle by accident. I paid him, feeling my hands shake as I handed him the money. I was grateful, terrified, and confused all at once. He didn't let it go, though. As I turned to prepare the kids for the ride home, he circled back and asked if I wanted him to place the tool in the back. I told him not to hand it to me directly. He set it gently on the floor of the trunk and reminded me, softly but firmly, to call the police when I got home. I drove away, trying not to let my fear show in front of the children, but the questions spun endlessly in my mind. Who was that first man? Why did he flee when the real mechanic arrived? What was he doing under the hood for so long? And what was that strange object meant to do? Once home, I got the kids inside and immediately called the police. They listened politely, but when I offered to bring in the object, they declined. The officer on the phone said it sounded like surgical shears, possibly old, but unnervingly specific in design. He advised me to keep the item in case they followed up. So I wrapped it in newspaper, placed it in a box, and stored it in a brick shed behind our home. It stayed there, untouched, for years, until the day we moved and I finally threw it away. I often think back to that night. At the time, I believed I was good at reading people, good at sensing danger, but being tired, distracted, and stranded with children had dulled my instincts. I let politeness override suspicion. I ignored the knots forming in my stomach, and if that second truck hadn't pulled in when it did, if the real mechanic had arrived even 10 minutes later, what might have happened to me and my children? The thought haunts me still. That stranger wanted me to step out of the car. He wanted me to lean under the hood, with my back turned and my children trapped behind me, and in his hands, hidden in the engine bay, was something sharp enough to end a life in silence. I've never forgotten the way the real mechanic looked at me that day, not with fear, but with something deeper. He didn't know what had almost happened, but he knew it wasn't right. When he placed that item in the trunk, he looked me in the eye and said quietly, "Mom, I don't know what was about to happen here, but I'm really glad I showed up when I did." His words still echo in my memory, carried on a chill breeze through a quiet parking lot under a darkening sky. I know I'll never get answers. The police never followed up. The object sat quietly in the shed untouched, forgotten by the world but never by me, and I learned, in that strange moment of stillness and silence, that not all dangers announce themselves with a roar. Some arrive with a smile, a nod, and the slow sound of metal brushing metal under a raised hood. Story number 2. Camping had always been my escape. The stillness of the forest, the quiet rustling of leaves, the crackling fire, it all gave me peace. I wasn't camping at official site this time, though. This was deep wilderness near Mount Rainier in Washington, far from the reach of campsites or cell towers. I had hiked in alone, following a winding trail that led to a clearing surrounded by towering pines. There, I pitched my tent and lit a fire. No one else was supposed to be out here. I had gone far enough to ensure complete solitude. That night, as the fire slowly died and I tucked myself into my sleeping bag, I fell asleep to the sounds of the wind brushing tree limbs together and the faint chorus of distant crickets. It was late, and I drifted off without any trouble, until I woke up to a faint sound near the tent. I opened my eyes to darkness and instinctively reached for the flashlight beside me. My heart skipped a beat when I saw the shadow of a person sitting beside the fire pit. just outside my tent. He wasn't doing anything, just sitting. I sat up, my breath caught in my throat. He looked like an ordinary man, not disheveled or dangerous at a glance, but the fact that he was just there, in the middle of nowhere, without a bag, a tent, or any gear, was deeply unsettling. I tried to calm myself, telling myself maybe he was just lost, maybe confused. But then he saw me move inside the tent, and his eyes grew wide, wild even, as if he'd seen something unnatural. Without a word, he bolted, just stood up and ran into the woods like a deer spooked by headlights. His reaction sent a strange chill through my body. I lay there for a long while, frozen, listening to the woods reclaim their silence. The next day, I pushed the experience aside, convincing myself it had been a strange encounter with someone high or sleepwalking. Even people can act oddly when disoriented in the woods. I packed my gear and hiked several miles deeper into the forest in a completely different direction. The path I took was so meandering and obscure that it was nearly impossible for someone to follow it unintentionally. That night, I set up a new camp near a small stream. The forest felt peaceful again, though some of the unease from the night before lingered in the back of my mind. As dusk faded into night, I stoked the fire and tried to focus on my surroundings, listening for anything unusual. But then I began to hear soft noises, rustling that grew more deliberate over time, as though someone was pacing just beyond the firelight. At first I called out, asking if someone was there. That's when a voice responded. A man's voice, casual and even-toned, drifted out from the darkness. "Hey, do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?" My stomach dropped. There was no such place on the maps I had studied before the trip. I hadn't seen a single sign mentioning it. Still, I answered honestly, "No, I don't think that's nearby." But he didn't step into the firelight. Instead, he kept speaking from the shadows, asking unrelated, rambling questions. Something about dogs, something about rain. Then silence, and the sound of him stepping closer. I raised my flashlight, trying to catch a glimpse of him. "Don't aim that over here," he shouted suddenly, the voice sharp and frantic now. I lowered the light quickly, trying to avoid provoking him further. I was scared, but I didn't want to escalate the situation. He kept talking, muttering odd things from the darkness. Minutes passed. I barely breathed. Then, suddenly I lifted the flashlight again, this time slowly, hesitantly. I needed to see. And when the beam cut through the trees, there he was. The same man from 2 nights before, same clothes, same face, same eyes. I froze. My mind reeled. There was no way this was a coincidence. He had followed me. Not just by accident, not just stumbled into my camp, he had tracked me. The moment the light landed on him, he turned and ran again, vanishing into the trees like some phantom of the forest. This time I tried to chase after him, flashlight in hand, but after barely 100 feet I stopped. I couldn't risk losing my bearings in the dark. I stood there, breathless, listening to the echo of his steps vanish into the trees. That was it. The trip was over. I packed up at first light, too afraid to stay another night. As I hiked out, I constantly changed my path, doubling back, hiding, stopping for long periods just to listen. The sense of being followed never left me. I felt like prey, like some animal being hunted. It was no longer just a hiker's fear. This was different. This was survival. That first night on my way out, I barely slept. Twice I heard footsteps circling my tent, slow and deliberate. I dared to peek once, but saw nothing. The second night, I heard sounds again, howls in the distance that didn't sound like any coyote ever heard. Something about them was too human. I didn't see him again, but I didn't have to. I could feel him. That feeling, the primal fear of being stalked, clung to me for days. My flashlight stayed in my hand at all times. I ate in silence, slept in fits. Every rustle, every breeze felt like his breath. When I finally reached the parking area where I'd left my car, I broke down. Not from exhaustion, not from physical strain, but from the overwhelming relief of being out of that forest. Even now, when I think back on it, I try to understand what his intentions were. Was he just disturbed? Was he trying to scare me? Was there something darker behind that expressionless stare? I'll never know. But I do know he found me twice in different places without ever leaving a trace. No tracks. No voice echoing far behind. Just silence. And then presence. Like a shadow that slipped between trees and soundlessly reappeared. I've been hiking many times since then, but never alone. I still love the forest, but I no longer trust it blindly. That kind of fear changes something in you. It sharpens your instincts, but also scars them. When people ask me why I don't camp solo anymore, I sometimes smile and say, I just grew out of it. But the truth is quieter. It lives in the rustle of leaves behind your tent, in the crack of a twig where no one should be, in the voice that comes from just outside the light, asking questions that don't make sense. The forest is a beautiful ancient place, but sometimes, when you walk too far in, something walks in with you. Story number 3. Asana. It happened more than 3 decades ago, yet the memory still lingers like a shadow that never quite fades. I was 22 at the time, a college student juggling late-night shifts as a disc jockey, and the slow unraveling of my family's stability. My parents had divorced a few years earlier, and my brothers and I lived with my mother. Our father, charismatic, unreliable, and always 1 foot out the door, popped in and out of our lives with all the grace of a ghost. He gambled frequently, a vice that had ruined more than his finances. Still, whenever he won big, he'd reappear with gifts, take us out, then vanish again without warning. During one of those rare returns, he told us a wild story. He worked as a shuttle driver for a local hotel. Yes, but his real job, he claimed, was ferrying fugitives for the organized crime syndicate that secretly owned the place. We laughed it off. He was always telling tall tales. But then my dad disappeared. This time it was different. No calls, no visits, no word. Months passed. One day my brother, who worked at a Dairy Queen, called us in a panic. 2 men had come by, asking about our father. At first they were vague, not revealing much. The next day they returned, this time flashing badges and claiming to be FBI agents. They were aggressive, demanding to know my father's whereabouts. My brother, genuinely in the dark, told them he hadn't heard from our dad in months. He called us afterward, his voice shaky. That was when things began to feel serious. We tried calling the hotel where our dad claimed to work. The manager who answered told my mother that my dad hadn't shown up in weeks. He sounded concerned, but not surprised. Shortly after, my brother's roommate came home to find their apartment ransacked. The sliding glass door was ajar, and although nothing of real value was missing, a few personal items were: an address book, a photo of my nephew, and a teddy bear that had recently been a gift. They had left behind a mess of papers and clothing, as though they'd searched for something. My brother was deeply shaken. He reported it, but we all knew who had likely been behind it. We went to the local FBI office to report the incident, only to be met with confusion. According to them, no agents had visited my brother. They weren't even looking for my dad, or so they claimed. When my mother mentioned the possibility of organized crime involvement, the agent remained vague, refusing to confirm or deny anything. Around that time, I remembered something that sent a chill down my spine. A few weeks earlier, I had experienced something strange. After visiting a friend who worked overnight at a cable company, I left the building around 3:30 a.m. As soon as I pulled out of the lot, a car appeared behind me out of nowhere. tailgating closely, high beams on, making it impossible to see who was inside. No matter how many times I changed lanes, the car mirrored every move. At a red light, I turned on my signal to turn left, but at the last second, I veered right across the intersection, hoping to lose him. He followed. I ducked into a quiet neighborhood, then doubled back toward the main road, heart racing. Eventually, I pulled into a brightly lit 7-Eleven and ran inside. The clerk stared at me, disinterested, as I explained that someone was following me. Meanwhile, the car cruised past slowly, high beams flashing once more before disappearing. Shaken, I didn't want to go home directly. I was afraid whoever was following me might see where I lived, so I drove to the radio station where a friend of mine, Paula, was on air. I told her everything, and she tried to reassure me, said it was probably just teenagers messing around. After a couple of hours, I calmed down and drove home, but as I pulled into my street, my blood ran cold. The same car was exiting my apartment complex. Our eyes met, even through the windshield. They flashed their high beams at me again, slowly, deliberately, before driving away. I called Paula, breathless. They were waiting for me, I said. They know where I live. To this day, I don't know how they found me. My dad had given me that car only 2 months earlier. I started to wonder if they thought I was him. My mother, my brother, and I went to the police. We filed a missing person report and told them everything we knew. A few days later, we received a call from a local detective. He had found my father alive. According to the detective, Dad had skipped town after racking up over $50,000 in gambling debts. The men looking for him weren't with the FBI. They were bounty hunters or hired collectors, and they weren't above impersonating law enforcement to track him down. The detective said that my dad was hiding out in Nevada and had no plans to return anytime soon. The entire situation felt like something out of a noir film, but it was real, and it had shaken our family to its core. We asked about the men who had harassed my brother. The detective explained that it was common for aggressive bounty hunters to break into homes, steal personal items to intimidate or track people down. The address book, the teddy bear, the photo, they were tools of fear. When we asked why only my brother had been targeted, the detective revealed something that made everything click. My father had used my brother's contact information on his job application at the hotel. To them, he was the most likely lead. They believed he could be persuaded, or frightened, into revealing Dad's location. As for the car following me, the detective shrugged. It was probably the same men, thinking I was my dad, until they got close enough to realize I wasn't. Eventually, my father returned to town as though nothing had happened. He never spoke about his disappearance, never mentioned the debts, never explained why he had let his sons and ex-wife suffer the fallout. He just reappeared, a ghost pretending he'd never vanished. My brother eventually moved to another city. I stayed busy with school and radio, but the sense of unease lingered long after. My mother, though stronger than she gave herself credit for, never quite trusted shadows after that. We had stared into a part of our father's world that had been hidden behind jokes and half-truths for years, and we didn't like what we saw. Sometimes, I still wonder what would have happened if those men had mistaken me for my father and decided not to leave, or if my brother had been home during the break-in. The what-ifs swirl late at night, when the house is quiet and the past returns in whispers. We survived that strange chapter, but not unchanged. It taught us that even the ones we think we know can lead lives we don't understand. That danger doesn't always come with a warning. And that sometimes the most frightening part of the story is simply not knowing the whole truth. Story number 4. I had never heard the term shadow people before. I didn't know what to call what I had seen. Not really. Years later, when I typed the word Shadow Hatman into a search engine, what came up chilled me to the core. Story after story described encounters eerily similar to mine, but none exactly matched. Mine didn't happen in a dark hallway or out of the corner of my eye. It happened in the light, broad daylight, just feet away from me. I was about 12 or 13 at the time, still a kid who liked cartoons and sugary cereal on the weekends. It was a Saturday morning, no school, just a lazy, quiet start to the day. I remember eating breakfast with my parents, watching the two of them get into a loud argument before they both disappeared into their room to hash it out in private. After finishing breakfast, I went to the bathroom to brush my teeth. The layout of our house was simple, and the bathroom sink was just inside the doorway. I stepped in, turned on the faucet, and began brushing. There was a large mirror over the sink, and I didn't see anything unusual behind me. I finished brushing and was about to leave when something strange happened. I was overcome by a heavy sensation, like a wave of dread washing over me. My skin prickled, and I felt like someone was standing right behind me. I slowly turned to look, and at first I saw nothing. But then, just outside the bathroom doorway, standing in the hallway, was a figure. Tall, dark, featureless. Not like a person in shadow, more like a shadow in the shape of a person. The figure loomed just a few feet away, too tall to walk through the door without ducking. It had no face, no clothes, no features. But what it did have were eyes, glowing red eyes that stared directly into me. It didn't move at first. It just stood there, watching. My body froze. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. My vocal cords locked up, like they weren't connected to my brain anymore. That's the part that has haunted me most, that moment where fear took over everything. Then, the figure reached out with one long, skinny hand, extending its arm toward me, fingers pointing with eerie precision. The hand was thin and elongated, almost cartoonishly so. In that moment, I thought I was going to die. It took one step toward me, just one, and then vanished. It didn't fade. It didn't turn. It just wasn't there anymore. As suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. That was all the motivation I needed. I bolted from the bathroom and ran straight to my parents' room. I burst in, breathless, trying to explain what I'd seen, but my words came out jumbled. My mom seemed indifferent, brushing it off as a child's imagination. My dad laughed, said I must have been watching too many horror movies. That's who he was, the kind of dad who would stand in the middle of a haunted kitchen and say, "There's nothing wrong with this house," as knives levitated around him. They didn't believe me, and honestly, I didn't expect them to. But after that day I changed. Every time I went to the bathroom, I made sure to shut the door completely. I never left it open, not even a crack. I started sleeping with a nightlight again, something I hadn't done in years, for months, maybe even years after. It felt like I could still sense something watching me. Not always, but sometimes, when I was alone in a room or walking down the hall in the middle of the night, the air would change. It would get colder, heavier, like I had stepped into a room someone else had just left. And always, in those moments, I would remember the eyes. Red, unblinking, intelligent. Years passed. I moved out, grew up, but the memory stayed. Then one day I was online and came across a thread about shadow people. At first I thought it was just a coincidence. Then I read more. The stories were different in their details. Some saw figures in dreams, others while falling asleep. But the core experience was always the same. The overwhelming dread, the paralysis, the unshakable feeling of being watched by something not quite human. One particular story described a tall man in a hat, standing just outside the doorway, watching. It was like being pulled backward through time. I wasn't 12 anymore, but I felt that same icy ripple down my spine. I realized I wasn't alone. It brought a strange kind of comfort, knowing others had seen him, or something like him, but also a deeper fear. If others had encountered this presence in different parts of the world, at different times in their lives, then what was it? A hallucination? A dream? A spiritual entity? None of the theories fully explain the precision of the experience or the intensity of the fear. I wasn't asleep. I wasn't half awake. I was brushing my teeth. Awake. Aware. In control until I wasn't. That's what makes it so real to me even now. There's a difference between a dream and something you see in the waking world. Something that leaves you changed. I've told a few people over the years, but most laugh or shift uncomfortably and change the subject. That's okay. I don't tell the story for validation. I tell it because it happened. Because even today, more than 17 years later, I still sometimes wake up in the middle of the night and check the doorway, just in case. I still keep my bathroom door shut when I brush my teeth. Not because I'm afraid he'll return, but because part of me knows he never really left. He's out there somewhere, waiting, watching. And if you ever feel a sudden chill, a silent gaze at your back, a pressure in the air that wasn't there a second ago, don't turn around too quickly. And if you do see him, tall, faceless, with eyes like embers, know that he has no reason. He offers no explanation. He simply observes, and for reasons we may never understand, sometimes he chooses to be seen. Story number 5. It happened when I was 11 years old, on a night that felt unusually quiet. Just me and my little brother at home. He was 7, full of imagination, always asking questions and drawing superheroes. My parents had gone out, probably just running errands or seeing friends, and it was one of the rare times they left us alone. It was raining heavily outside, not just a drizzle but a relentless downpour that drummed against the windows and echoed across the rooftop. Our room was right next to the front door, and our blinds were open to let in what little light there was from the porch. We sat together on the bed, each with a book, the only sound of pages turning in the storm's steady rhythm. That was when the doorbell rang. At first, I thought it had to be our parents. Maybe they forgot their keys or brought home food. But as I stood up and looked through the side window, something didn't feel right. There was no car in the driveway, no familiar silhouette on the porch. Then came a knock, 3 slow taps, and a man's voice called out, "Would you guys like some cookies? We're selling Girl Scout cookies." I froze. My parents weren't home. It was late. The rain hadn't stopped. And there was something too deliberate in his tone, too rehearsed. My heartbeat picked up as I edged closer to the window, careful not to be seen. When I looked again, my stomach sank. It wasn't a scout. It wasn't a parent. It was just a man older, probably in his 50s, standing completely alone and completely soaked, with no box of cookies in sight. His clothes were clinging to him, and he had no umbrella. He stood too calmly for someone caught in a storm. He didn't shield his eyes, didn't shuffle from foot to foot like someone waiting politely. He just stood there, patient, quiet, watching. I backed away from the window and checked the locks. 2 deadbolts. My hands trembled slightly as I turned each one, hoping he hadn't heard the clicks. Then I remembered. Our blinds were still open. My little brother sat on the bed, completely visible under the soft ceiling light, flipping through his book without a care in the world. I panicked. Carefully I moved toward the window in our room and saw the man again. This time he was leaning closer, peering in, eyes locked on my brother. I lunged forward and yanked the blinds shut in one motion. I didn't care if he saw me anymore. The illusion of us being unaware was gone. I turned off the light, casting the room in shadow. My brother looked up at me, confused. I didn't want to scare him, so I told him to grab his book and follow me. We walked quickly but quietly down the hallway to the deepest part of the house, I told him we were going to hang out in the hallway closet for a while, play a game. I said. He didn't question it. I shut us in, surrounded by coats and dusty boxes, the only light a sliver under the door. I didn't call the police. I can't explain why. Maybe it was fear. Maybe I hoped he'd leave once he saw the blinds closed and lights off. Maybe I was afraid to speak aloud, afraid he'd hear. We stayed in that closet for what felt like hours. I listened to the rain, to every creak in the house, every shifting floorboard, every gust of wind. My brother eventually fell asleep on a pillow I'd pulled from the hall bench. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. My mind was fixed on the porch, on the window, on that face staring in. I imagined him trying the door handle. I imagined him finding a way in. But eventually the sound stopped. The rain eased. The silence returned. When I finally stepped out and peeked around the corner toward the front window, he was gone. Still, that night left its mark on me. For years, I double-checked every lock, even when others swore they already had. I slept with my closet door closed, my blinds drawn, my light on low. My brother barely remembers it. He thinks of it as a strange night we played hide and seek in the hallway. But I remember everything. I remember the expression on the man's face. Not angry, not confused, just cold, focused. I remember thinking he wasn't trying to sell cookies. He was testing something, seeing how far he could go, seeing if anyone would open the door. And if I had unlocked it just once, even to tell him to leave, I don't think I'd be here to tell this story. Looking back, I realize how vulnerable we were. No cell phones, no neighbors nearby, just two kids and the sound of rain. I still wonder what he was hoping to find. Was he just a drifter walking the streets in search of opportunity? Or was this planned? Had he watched the house before? Did he know our parents weren't home? I'll never know, and maybe that's the part that haunts me most. The unknown, the what if, the quiet between the knocks. Over time, I've told a few close friends about that night. Most listen politely, some brush it off as a misunderstanding. But I know what I saw. I know how it felt. And sometimes, on rainy nights when the wind presses against the window panes and the world feels just a little too quiet, I think of the porch light flickering against wet pavement. I think of footsteps in the dark. I think of a voice saying, "Would you like some cookies?" And I quietly get up, check the locks, and close the blinds once more. Story number 6. When I think back to that day in rural Pennsylvania, I can still hear the wind rustling through the trees that bordered our childhood home. I must have been around 8 years old, and my little brother was about 5. We lived on a couple of acres surrounded by a patchwork of open fields and thick, dark forest. On one side of the property was a neighbor's farm. Horses, cows, the occasional rooster, and on the other, just dense, wild woods. The kind of woods that looked like they had no end. Our father was a hunter and an outdoorsman, and he made sure we understood the basics of staying safe. We were taught to stay away from strangers, to never wander off without telling an adult, and to always respect the boundaries of the forest. But none of that prepared me for what I heard that day. It started simply. My brother had gone inside to grab a snack, and I stayed out in the yard, bouncing a ball and letting my mind drift in the lazy warmth of the afternoon. That's when I heard my name. Kimberly, come here. At first I smiled, thinking it was my mom calling me from the woods behind our house. But then I paused. Why would she be in the woods? She always called us from the back porch or through the kitchen window. I stopped bouncing the ball and listened again. Kimmy, come here. Over here. It was definitely a voice. Calm, cheerful, familiar. And it was coming from the forest. I moved to the fence line slowly, curiosity pulling at me. But something in the back of my mind whispered that something wasn't quite right. I remember glancing back at the house and wondering, Had she walked into the woods without me seeing? The voice came again, a little more distant now, and I made a decision. I climbed the fence and began to walk toward the sound. The woods swallowed me almost immediately. The moment I crossed into the tree line, the light dimmed, and the air felt heavier. I took a few cautious steps, leaves crunching underfoot, my heart fluttering like a nervous bird. But then something changed. The voice stopped, and in its place, I felt a strange stillness. Not quiet, there were still sounds of nature all around, but the kind of stillness that makes your skin crawl. It was like the forest was watching me. I froze in place. I felt eyes, though I couldn't say from where. My instincts finally kicked in. That small, primal voice inside that every child carries without knowing it. Something was wrong. My mum wouldn't call me from the woods. She wouldn't be standing among the trees, beckoning me deeper. Slowly I turned around and began walking back the way I came. My legs felt heavy, like I was wading through water. Every few steps I looked over my shoulder, expecting to see someone, something, standing there. But the path remained empty. I climbed back over the fence, my breath catching in my throat, and ran to the back door. When I stepped inside, my mum was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, my little brother in the living room playing video games. The moment I saw her, the unease in my chest collapsed into a knot. I asked if she had been outside calling me. She looked up, surprised, and shook her head. No, sweetie. I've been here the whole time. My face must have turned pale, because she stood and asked what was wrong. I tried to explain, but I think even then I knew it sounded impossible. She nodded slowly and told me to stay inside for the rest of the day. We didn't talk about it again until years later. I've asked her about it several times as an adult. She always swears she never called for me that day, never stepped outside. She remembers how shaken I was, though, and how tightly I clung to her for the rest of the afternoon. There was something about that voice, so perfect, so familiar, and yet not right, like someone had worn my mother's voice like a costume. Over the years, I've read stories of people hearing their names called in the woods, of voices mimicking loved ones, always just out of sight. They often describe it as something ancient and unknowable, a trickster force that lies deep within the trees. The older I get, the more I believe that day was something beyond explanation. I don't know what I heard, or who or what was trying to lure me into the woods, but I do know that I was only a few steps away from following that voice farther, and I don't know what would have happened if I had. Maybe nothing, maybe everything. All I know is that I trusted a voice that felt like home, and was nearly pulled into something I couldn't understand, something I still feel in my bones when the forest grows too quiet. Now, whenever I visit that old house, I always look toward the trees. They're still there, as dark and dense as ever, and sometimes, just sometimes, when the wind moves just right, I swear I hear my name again, soft and lilting, drifting through the air like a lullaby. But I don't go looking. I don't follow. I simply turn away, step back inside, and shut the door behind me. Because the forest remembers. Story number 7. It was one of those quiet nights where the streets felt hollow, like the world was pausing to take a breath. I was just a teenager then, 18 or 19, freshly moved from the busy city into a quieter part of town, where the streetlights were spread far apart and shadows stretched long between them. I was driving home late, the roads nearly deserted, and the silence in the car was both comforting and eerie. Then, I noticed it, a police cruiser pulling up behind me. I didn't think much of it at first. It's not uncommon to see a patrol car trailing behind, especially at night. But something felt off. There were no lights flashing, no siren, not even the glow of a dashboard monitor. It was riding too close. As I glanced into my rearview mirror, I realized I couldn't make out the driver's face. The cruiser's headlights were off. The street lamps provided only enough light to see the vague shape of the vehicle. It was close enough to almost touch my bumper, yet I couldn't even make out how many people were inside. I turned into a left lane, trying to create some space. The cruiser turned too. I switched lanes again. Same. It mimicked every move like a shadow. My pulse quickened. I didn't know what I had done wrong. There was no traffic, no sudden stops, no rules broken, just this car following in perfect silence. I pulled to the side of the road, figuring the officer might finally get out and explain. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe my taillight was out. But when I stopped, the cruiser stopped behind me, and nothing happened. No movement, no door opening, no one stepping out. I waited. 1 minute, 2, then 5. Still no one emerged. It was just me sitting there in silence with a blacked-out cruiser behind me and a stretch of empty street ahead. I began to feel like prey, not because of flashing lights or loud voices, but because of the quiet, the stillness. I stared into my rearview mirror, unable to see a face, unable to read an intention. After several long minutes, I felt the urge to flee building in my chest. Something primal whispered, "Go." So I started my engine and pulled away, slowly at first. I expected to see the cruiser's lights flicker on, a siren blaring behind me, but it didn't follow. It stayed parked, alone in the shadows, and I kept driving, my heart pounding like a drumbeat in my ears. I took a few turns, made sure I wasn't being tailed, and only then allowed myself to breathe. I thought about pulling into a gas station or calling someone, but I wasn't sure what to say. I wasn't even sure what had just happened. There are all kinds of ways to feel fear. Sometimes it's loud and fast, like when a door slams in the middle of the night, but sometimes it's slow and quiet, like a question with no answer. I never reported the incident. What would I have said? A police cruiser followed me without following me. The silence of that night haunted me for weeks afterward. I avoided that part of town. I checked my mirrors obsessively, and whenever I passed a parked police car, I couldn't help but glance inside, looking for that same unseeable silhouette. I told a few friends, and most of them said it was probably nothing. Maybe a bored rookie playing a joke, maybe someone pretending to be a cop, maybe my own nerves twisting an ordinary moment into something darker. But I know what I felt. That cold quiet, the kind that seeps into your bones and tells you that something isn't right. I've encountered plenty of police cars since then. Routine traffic stops, flashing lights, all of it. But none of them felt like that. That night didn't feel like law. It felt like something else entirely. Like something was watching me to see how I would react, as if I was being tested. Over time, I let the fear fade. Life moved on. But every now and then, I'll be driving alone on a quiet road, and I'll glance in my mirror and remember that empty cruiser, the one that didn't flash its lights, the one that didn't move. And I wonder who or what was really sitting behind that wheel. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was everything. But in the quietest corners of my memory, I can still feel it watching, still waiting. Some moments don't need a scream to be frightening. Sometimes all it takes is silence, stillness, and a presence that doesn't feel quite human. I've come to learn that fear isn't always about what's said or done. Sometimes it's about what isn't. And that night, in the hush of an empty street, I learned that silence can be the loudest thing of all. Story number 8. 8. A year ago, I experienced something that still makes my skin crawl, though the memory has grown quieter with time. It started in a way that felt ordinary. I was 15, living in a large, creaky house in Switzerland with my family. The kind of house that had history in its walls. After a year of dating a girl from my neighborhood, someone warm, creative, a little anxious, she eventually moved in with us. My parents lived on the ground floor. My girlfriend and I took the middle, and the upper floor had been left empty. It was once used for guests but had grown dusty and forgotten, like an attic too big for storage yet too abandoned to feel welcoming. Still, our house never felt haunted, until it did. At first it was just little things. Noises at night. A faint sound like someone walking above us. I'd always say it was the wind, or the beams adjusting, because the house was old and wood plays tricks with sound. But my girlfriend, she wasn't so sure. She'd shake me awake at 2 a.m, whispering, "Did you hear that?" I'd blink, half asleep, and tell her it was nothing. But the thing was, I'd started hearing things too. I just didn't want to admit it. The more she mentioned footsteps above us, the more my ears began to tune into the quiet that followed them. I told myself it was paranoia, that I was just catching her nervousness. But when fear creeps in slowly, it doesn't always feel like fear. It feels like doubt. The house never felt dangerous, just uneasy. My girlfriend would ask me to go with her whenever she needed something from upstairs, even during the day, and over time I started avoiding it too. The upper floor always seemed just a little too cold, even in the summer. The air felt heavier. We kept the door to that staircase shut, like we were trying to close off the part of the house that had started to make us both feel small. We told ourselves it was nothing, until one night it wasn't. It was a summer evening, and my brother had invited the family over for a barbecue. The food was good, the night was warm, and everyone was in a good mood. When it got late, my parents decided to sleep over at my brother's place, so we drove back home, me, my girlfriend, my sister, and our boyfriend. It was after 3 a.m. when we pulled into the driveway. The house stood quietly in the dark, just the porch light casting a golden glow across the gravel. My sister looked up and casually said, "Hey, I think someone left a light on upstairs." We all looked. One window glowed faintly. At first I thought maybe it was the middle floor, but my girlfriend shook her head. "No, that's the top floor." We paused. The light shouldn't be on. No one had been up there for weeks. The switch to that light was on the upper floor itself, which meant someone had to be up there to turn it on. That's when my girlfriend grabbed my hand. Tight. We stood there, 4 people frozen beside a car, staring at a lit window and a floor none of us used. And then something happened that made my stomach sink. A shape moved in the window. Slow. Deliberate. A person, no figure, walked across and stood still, staring directly down at us. We all saw it. None of us spoke. We didn't have to. In one motion, we jumped into the car, reversed out of the driveway, and drove away as fast as the road allowed. None of us argued about what we saw. There were no questions, only silence. The kind of silence that wraps around fear like a blanket. It was real. Someone, or something, had been standing in that window, watching us arrive. We didn't go back right away. When we finally did return days later, it was only to gather our things. We entered the house in the daylight together, and even then, none of us dared go upstairs. The upper floor remained untouched, and we never spent another night there. My parents eventually sold the house, and none of us ever looked back, but that night lives in me still. The shape in the window wasn't just a person, it was something else, something that didn't move the way it should have, something that knew we were watching and wanted us to see it. I don't try to explain it anymore. People always offer theories. An intruder, a trick of the light, sleep deprivation. But there were 4 of us, wide awake, alert, and we all saw the same thing. No break-in, no signs of forced entry, no footprints, just a quiet, old house, a turned-on light, and a silhouette that shouldn't have been there. Even now, when I think of that night, I remember the way it moved. Not fast, not frantic, just calm. like it belonged there more than we did, like we were the ones trespassing. I often wonder what would have happened if we'd gone inside, if we'd climbed those stairs. That house taught me something I didn't understand before. Sometimes, it's not the things you can't explain that frighten you. It's the ones that don't try to hide, the ones that stand in plain view and wait. That light in the window never turned off until the next morning, when the sun rose and washed it away. But even sunlight doesn't make you forget. It just makes the darkness easier to live with, and when I close my eyes at night, I can still see the window, the faint yellow glow, and the shape watching us, unmoving, as though it had been waiting for us all along. Story number 9. It was February of 2019, and I was 17 at the time, living in the UK and dipping my toes into the uncomfortable waters of dating. I had just been set up on a semi-blind date by a mutual friend, someone who had shown me a few pictures of him beforehand. His name was Cameron. He looked fairly average, nothing intimidating, just a typical guy who seemed a little into video games and anime. From what I'd been told, nothing about him stood out as alarming. He wasn't some stranger from the internet. He was someone vouched for by someone I knew. That made me feel safe enough to agree to meet. We decided to meet the next day at a local Starbucks. It was public, casual, easy. I didn't expect anything other than awkward small talk. I arrived a little early, just before our agreed time. I didn't want him to feel pressured to pay for anything, so I ordered my coffee in advance and found a seat near the back, facing away from the entrance. I pulled out a book, letting the quiet hum of cafe noise lull me into a moment of peace. I'd been sitting there maybe 15 minutes when I got a text saying he was there. I replied, let him know where I was seated, and turned slightly in anticipation. I felt someone step behind me, their presence unmistakable. Then, without a word, without so much as a hello, he leaned down and placed his lips directly onto my neck and began sucking on my skin. Time slowed. I was stunned, completely frozen, caught between disbelief and revulsion. It felt like he was trying to kiss my neck, but it was far more invasive. It was as if he was attempting to mark me before even speaking to me. I was painfully ticklish in that area. Always had been, but the discomfort ran deeper than a physical reaction. I elbowed him hard in the chest and twisted away, my heart pounding, my face flushed not with affection but with alarm. He stood there looking at me with this odd grin, as if what he'd done was perfectly normal, as if this was how you greet someone on a first date. I asked, in a strained voice, what the hell was that? His only response was a creepy little laugh and the words, I thought it was cute. Trying to salvage the situation, I took a deep breath and attempted to continue the conversation. Maybe it was just a very bizarre misunderstanding. Maybe nerves had scrambled his perception of appropriate behavior, but as I tried to talk, he just stared at me. Not at my face, not at my eyes, but at my chest. He barely tried to hide it. Then he said something that still echoes in my memory, word for word. Wow, I didn't know Asians could have boobs like those. I better not let you go. My stomach dropped. That wasn't nervous. That was creepy, unfiltered, objectifying. I no longer felt mildly awkward. I felt endangered. Still, I didn't want to make a scene. I didn't want to just run. I didn't want to find out what he might do if embarrassed in public. I excused myself, pretending to go to the bathroom, and stood in that small tiled room trying to collect myself. My heart was racing. I didn't feel safe anymore. I didn't even feel anonymous. I felt like I had been seen too closely by someone who didn't understand boundaries. After a few moments of pacing, I heard the bathroom door open. Another girl walked in and I asked her for help. I told her I was trying to avoid the guy I had just come in with. She didn't hesitate. She gave me a scarf and a hat and helped disguise me. Together we exited the bathroom, and she walked out with me like we were friends, shielding me from view as we exited through a back door. I never saw him watching us leave. Later, I found out he had asked our mutual friend where I went. I hadn't told her the full story yet, and instead of defending me, she scolded me, told me I was rude for disappearing without explanation. She said I should have given him a chance. I was stunned. I realized then how many people might dismiss what had happened as awkward or funny rather than see it for what it was, predatory and invasive. That friendship didn't last much longer. I quietly removed her from my life. There was no confrontation. I simply decided that anyone who could defend that kind of behavior wasn't someone I wanted in my corner. For weeks after, I was afraid I might bump into him again. Every time I went to the coffee shop, I scanned the room first. Even now, years later, I sometimes think about that moment, about how deeply unsettling it is to realize that someone thinks they have the right to touch you without your consent. I think about how normalized the behavior might have seemed to him, how he likely didn't consider, even for a second, how uncomfortable I was. I think about how important it is to trust that voice inside you that says something's wrong. Now, whenever someone shares a story that begins with, "It was just a bad date," I listen closely, because sometimes what's called a bad date is actually a moment where your intuition protected you, where you chose self-preservation over politeness. I don't feel guilty for leaving anymore. I don't regret slipping out the back door. I'm proud of it. That moment taught me to never override my instincts just to avoid seeming rude. That girl in the bathroom taught me that strangers can be your safest allies. And Cameron, he taught me exactly what kind of man I never want to be near again. People often imagine danger as something loud and obvious, but sometimes it enters softly, sits across from you with a coffee in hand, and smiles as though it's entitled to you. And when that happens, you learn quickly that silence can be a shield, but action is a sword. I'm grateful I had both that day.